They should set price and output when they have market power. With monopoly power, the firm's demand curve, of course, the industry demand curve. And they're gonna set price and quantity just like any other firm where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, except a base industry demand curve, which is downward sloping. A monopolist, by definition, has no close substitutes and is protected by barriers to entry. And then we're gonna talk about monopolistically competitive firms, which are almost exactly like perfectly competitive firms, except there's product heterogeneity. That means they can differentiate the product from other people in the market. Think of Coke and Pepsi. Okay. Okay, so we start with monopoly. There's a single seller in the market, one firm. They sell all the output in that firm. They sell a unique product, right? The output is received by customers to be distinctive and preferable to imperfect substitutes, i.e. there's no close substitutes. There's blockaded entry and exit. Other firms simply can't enter the market. It could be because of a law, a regulation, a patent, or maybe just a natural monopoly, and costs are too daunting for any other firms to enter the market. And there's also imperfect dissemination of information, right? Unlike perfect competition, where we assume that everybody knew everything about everybody, here the monopolist can keep what it's doing secret from the rest of the market, potential entrants, and even from customers. Okay. Because it's the only firm in the market, it faces the industry demand curve, right? More likely it's going to be downward sloping, and the monopolist has a choice of either choosing quantity or price. In addition, the monopolist demand curve, since he's not a perfectly competitive firm, is imperfectly elastic, which means it's not flat, right? And since it's downward sloping, that means marginal revenue won't equal price. Instead, marginal revenue will be below the demand curve. So here we have an example. I assume we have an inverse demand curve, P equals 10 minus Q. Therefore, total revenue, I can just get by multiplying Q times this inverse demand curve. So I have P times Q equals total revenue equals 10Q minus Q squared, which is just this, right, times Q. To get marginal revenue, I just take the derivative of total revenue with respect to Q, and I get 10 minus 2Q. I'm going to assume the total cost is as follows. Can you guys see that okay? Is it blurry to you as it is to me? I guess just the angle. This stuff looks ghostly. Okay. It's near Halloween, so. Okay. Total cost equals 1 plus Q plus 0.5 Q squared. Therefore, I take the derivative of this to get marginal cost. And profit we know is total revenue minus total cost. I can do that, set the derivative, set it equal to 0 to maximize profit, or I can set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue and solve for Q. Either way, we get the same answer at the profit maximizing point, right? Quantity is going to equal 3. I plug that back into my inverse demand curve, 3, and I get a price of 7. Profits at that point would be 3 times 7 minus the average total cost, which is just total cost divided by Q, and I plug in 3 for Q, and that would give me profits. And here's a table. My output is on the first column and price on the second column. Then I have my total revenue, right? And we can see it has increased, and it's maximized here around 5. I have my variable costs, right? 1.54, etc. It keeps increasing. I have my total cost, which is just fixed costs, which is 1 plus variable costs. Total revenue minus total cost will give me profits. And we can see that profits go at 0 units, it's -1. My fixed cost at 1 unit is 6.5, 2 units 11, 3 units 12.5, and then at 4 units 11, and it decreases from there and turns negative at 6 units. So 12.5, as we saw, is where we maximize our total profit. And our variable cost profit is maximized at the same spot. Variable cost profit, right, is simply total revenue minus variable cost, excluding fixed costs. And if you remember last time when we talked about perfect competition, the same thing applies. My variable costs, right, determine when I shut down. In other words, if I'm operating and I'm losing money, whether I operate or not will depend on whether my revenues are greater than my variable costs. In other words, do I lose less money operating than if I shut down totally? If I lose more money shutting down totally, I continue to operate. So in this case, my variable cost profit and my total profit are the same. They're not always going to be the same. Right? In this case, it's very low output. If you have much higher output, it could be very well the case that your total profit would be at a different point than your variable cost profit. Okay. Here's another graph. I have my total revenue in blue. I have my total costs in purple. And the difference between them, of course, is profit. And it's maximized here at 3, right, at 12.5, 21 minus 8.5. Okay. We have our profit function. And we know how to take the maximum of a function, right? I take the derivative, I set it equal to 0, and it gives me the maximum. If I want to test whether it's a maximum or minimum, I take my second derivative, but that's too much work. So we'll just assume it's a maximum, and we can see from the graph that it's a maximum. Okay. Questions? The next thing I want to talk about for the monopolist is marginal revenue. Like we've talked about before, they face a downward sloping demand curve. Therefore, the marginal revenue is always going to be below the demand curve. So, for a perfectly competitive firm, right, they had a horizontal demand curve and marginal revenue equals price. However, when the demand curve is downward sloping, marginal revenue is going to be below the demand curve. Okay. So, at any given price, marginal revenue is going to be less than demand. And the reason for that is that if I sell one more unit, right, the price I receive from that extra unit, right, decreases. That means my added revenue from that extra unit decreases. Hence, marginal revenue will always be below the demand curve. Unlike perfect competition for the firm where it's flat, where price equals marginal revenue. Right? Every additional unit I sell gives me exactly that extra revenue, that marginal revenue, which is equal to price. Okay. if you remember from our last two lectures, right? That the markup over price for any firm, right, is going to be marginal cost over 1 plus 1 over the point price elasticity of demand. That's the price elasticity of demand. And it's true for a monopolist as well, right? So I can rewrite this as marginal cost is equal to price times 1 plus 1 elasticity of demand, like we have here. But in this case, I know the profit maximizing point, marginal cost, is equal to marginal revenue. So I just substitute marginal revenue here, and I get the following, right? Which I can rewrite as follows: P minus P over the absolute value over elasticity of demand. Right? What this means is I have more pricing power, or my price above marginal cost is going to be greater the more inelastic, right, my my demand is. It also means that I'm never going to price at a point on the demand curve, especially with linear demand curve, that's inelastic. I'm going to, any point that I have is inelastic, I keep raising the price. Okay. So this profit maximizing monopolist isn't going to produce, right, where it's inelastic, or in other words, where the absolute value of elasticity of demand is less than 1, right? Because in that case, my marginal revenue is 0. I'm going to keep increasing price, right, to get out of that point. Just like we saw in our microbrewery example, where they had an inelastic demand, right? And we saw that raising price increases revenue. And after we increased price, we still had inelastic demand. And we knew that increasing the price at least one more time in the short run would also increase the revenue. And that'll be true for a monopolist. They'll keep doing it, right, until they get to a point where they're profit maximizing. And at that point, the elasticity of demand, right, will be elastic, or in absolute value will be greater than 1. Okay. Questions? Okay, here's a table, or the same table we had a while ago, except that we switched the price column and the output column, right? And we're still maximizing profit, where output is 3 and price is 7, right? We get a profit of 12.5. At those points, marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And that's our condition for profit maximizing, right? Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And I see that my elasticity of demand is negative 2.33, or an absolute value 2.33, which is greater than 1, which means it's elastic at that point. Down here, right, where it's greater than negative 1, or in absolute terms less than 1, right? At these points, I'm going to keep raising price. Once I get here, I'm in the elastic portion, and I'll keep raising price until I get to the profit maximizing point. And in which case, my demand will be elastic for the monopolist. Preguntas?
You mentioned that a good monopolist will not produce more when demand is inelastic.
You'll keep raising. I'll keep raising price. Right? So if I find my demand's inelastic, I'm not at the profit maximizing point, I keep raising price. So here's the graph. This monopoly faces, right, a downward sloping demand curve, this purple line here. This lighter purple line is this marginal revenue curve, which is below the demand curve. I have my average variable cost, my average total cost, and I have my marginal cost. Of course, marginal cost intersects average variable cost and average total cost at their minimum. And as a profit maximizer, the monopolist sets marginal revenue equal to, help me out. Marginal cost. Okay. I wanted that in unison. I wanted a big, loud marginal cost. Come on, man. Help me out. All right. So marginal revenue equals marginal cost is right here. So he sets that quantity, which is QN, quantity monopoly. And then price is determined by the demand curve at that quantity. So I charge PM, the price of a monopolist, right, at QN. Be careful. It hasn't happened in a while because I started warning my students, and I hope it doesn't happen again. I've had students in the past, and actually a lot of them before I started warning, they'll pick the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue for the monopolist. They'll go up and they say price is right here. That's not the price. In fact, if you set price there, you'd be, in this case, you'd be losing a lot of money. Instead, right, you go up to the demand curve, and that determines the price. Profit, on the other hand, will be per unit, will be the difference between the price and the average total cost at that point, QM. So it'll be this rectangle here is profit, and my average variable cost profit, right, at QM will go up to my average variable cost, and it'll be this triangle right here that's almost a square, right? Questions? Am I going too fast? Okay. I'm not sure if that's a yes or no. Okay. Okay, let's try another example, mathematical. Suppose I have an inverse demand curve as follows. P equals 80 minus 0.0008 Q. If I have that inverse demand curve, how do I get total revenue from that? I have this inverse demand curve, P equals 80 minus 0.0008 Q. How do I get total revenue? Okay, what's our definition of total revenue?
Price times quantity.
Price times quantity. Okay. I'm hearing from over there, but I'm not hearing, like, I know about, I guess I shouldn't say that. About a third of you guys are female, and I don't hear any female voices. I know you guys got to be on top of this better than men. So, come on. All right, so P times Q. So what I do is I multiply my inverse demand curve times Q, right? And that gives me total revenue. So that'll be 80Q minus 0.0008 Q squared, right? Then I take the derivative of that. In this case, I have large changes. The change in P times Q over Q. So I have the change in Q, the change, Q times 80, 0.0008 Q. And that gives me, right, 80 minus 0.0008 times 2, or 0.0016. Okay. So that is my marginal revenue. In this case, I'm going to assume constant costs. So I'm going to set marginal cost equal to 20. That just makes it easy. I have a straight average cost curve, a straight marginal cost curve, and they're all, average variable costs, and they're all one on top of each other. Okay. So our profit maximizing point is where? Well, you gotta say it with more confidence. I heard like some mumbling. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. So I have my marginal revenue, 80 minus 0.0016 Q equals 20, and I solve for Q, right? To solve for Q is I take this over to that side, and I bring the 20 over here, and I have 0.0016 Q is equal to 60. I divide 60 by 0.0016, and I get 37,500. You guys want me to do that on the board? Are we good? Yeah. Does that mean yes, do it on the board, or yes, you're good?
Estaba contemplado.
Okay. Dime.
¿No podría dar, qué sé yo, un ejercicio para practicar?
You mean now off the top of my head? Okay, let's see. The problem is I do it off the top of my head, we might end up with negative numbers. Okay. How's that?
Is there supposed to be a Q?
See, that's what happens when I do it off the top of my head. Okay, so I have an inverse demand curve. P equals 60 minus 0.001 Q. From that, how do I get total revenue?
Multiplying by Q times Q.
Okay. So total revenue is equal to P times Q, or 62 minus. Actually, I'm not supposed to be writing that. I'm supposed to be letting you guys do it. Huh? My bad. Okay, so what's the next step after we have total revenue?
Sacar el original.
And how do we do that?
Sacar la derivada.
Respecto a female voice.
Well, we do the partial for the total revenue first.
Well, it's not a partial. It's
Wait, a straight derivative, sorry.
I understand what you mean. It's just so you
So it would be
got that
60.
terminology. Sometimes. What's that?
60 minus 0.002. Right.
002.
0.002. The 1 Q, right?
I'm sorry?
0.001 Q, right? Okay. So then when we have to make. So we have to make this.
Ah, y eso no se tira por la primera. 3,60.
Cost function, so this I know the kid's gonna be positive. If I would've done cost function, then. What's gonna be the price? Marginal cost would be, like I said, 'cause I'm doing it off the top of my head, if I would use a regular cost function, I might give you total cost, right? Or maybe total cost. So in this example on the board, I get marginal revenue by taking the derivative total revenue expected to 60 minus 0.001 times 2 or 60 minus 0.002 Q. I said marginal revenue equals to marginal cost. And I get 60 minus 0.002 Q is equal to 15. And from cheating, looking at your guys' work, I know it's 22,500. Okay, I put that into my inverse demand curve. You guys can calculate it. And to get price, and I think it's 57.50.
37.5. 37.5.
37.50. Okay. Okay. Okay, questions? Marginal cost is not always going to be fixed, right? It's possible that I give you a total cost, maybe an average cost. If I get the average cost, then I get marginal cost. Okay, multiply by 2 give me total cost, and then get marginal cost. Take the derivative. That's one way, or what do I know about the relationship between average total cost and marginal cost? Where do they intersect? That'll give you the minimum point, if I was asking for the minimum point. So right, the minimum point, the average total cost intersects the marginal cost at its minimum. but your way is better in general. Okay. Are you guys asking a question?
No.
Okay. Thomas? Okay, so, back to our example. I could do profit on the example I did on the board, right? I know what P is, I know what Q is, I know what my marginal cost is, and since it's flat, I know it's equal to my average total cost. I can get profit just like I got here. Price times quantity, 50 times 37,500, minus average cost times quantity, which is 27 times 3745, and I get a profit of 1,125,000. Questions? Okay. We saw the graph. This is the graph I made. This is what we think a normal monopoly would look like, right? Where we still have our U-shaped average total cost curve and our average variable cost curve, right? And the marginal cost curve intersects the average variable cost and average total cost at their minimum. I set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost and then charge, in this case, the price of P star, and total profits would be this rectangle here, and this bigger rectangle with average variable cost will be my variable cost profit. It's possible that the barriers to entry for monopoly are costs. In other words, the only way I can decrease costs is by producing a lot of units. If that's the case, that's known as a natural monopoly. It's an industry in which the market clearing price occurs at a point, at which the monopolist's long-run average costs are still declining. Okay? So it would look something like this, right? And these curves might have a U-shape, but there'll be a U-shaped layout here, and it's really irrelevant if they start increasing over here, since right the demand occurs way over here. So in this case, marginal cost is always going to be below average total cost and average variable cost, but I still set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, right, and charge a price of P star, and of course my profit will be this thing here. My average variable cost profit will be here, where average variable cost at Q and this bigger rectangle. But in this case, the market naturally tends to have just one producer, because this producer, right, has lower costs than anybody else that can enter the market, because the more he produces, the lower his costs become. Okay. And that's our definition of a natural monopoly. Questions? Okay, just some definitions from the book. This is on the book's PowerPoint, so I kept it on. Underproduction, a situation that occurs where the monopolist curtails production to a level at which marginal cost is less than price. We saw in the perfect competition, right, that the supply curve for the market was simply the sum of the upward sloping portions of the marginal cost curve. So just the sum of all the marginal costs. So in that case, right, we can think of price is equal to marginal cost. Also for the firm, since they face a perfectly elastic demand curve, in other words, their demand curve is flat, right? Price equals marginal revenue in that case, and for the profit maximizing firm will equal marginal revenue. So under perfect competition, marginal cost equals price. For a monopoly, right, marginal cost will be below price, which means, according to that point, they're underproducing. And that's what we mean by underproduction. Countervailing power, simply a buyer with market power that can offset the seller's market power. In other words, it's hard for a monopoly, but say you're an oligopoly, and the only buyer out there, right, was you. You can negotiate, even with a monopoly, but more so if there was more competition, like an oligopoly, and get a lower price, right? Because even a monopoly, if you're the only buyer out there and you don't buy, well, the monopoly doesn't make any money. So you do have some countervailing power as per the definition of the book. Okay. Questions so far? Okay, well, we've seen how a monopoly theoretically should set price and quantity. The problem is that marginal cost curves are really difficult to measure, and so is marginal revenue. And it changes from one point to the next. So the way firms get around that usually is by experimenting with price. Other strategies are something known as cost plus pricing, and you've probably all seen this. It's a very simple strategy that guarantees that price is higher than average cost. Whatever my costs are, right, I just set a markup above my costs and I charge that price. Pretty much every study I've read, right, says that when you do this, you're not pricing optimized. You can mess with your price a little bit and you get closer to marginal revenue for marginal cost and profit maximization. The market's pretty simple, as we said. It's just price minus cost divided by cost. And of course, that's average cost. So therefore, taking this and solving for price, I get price is equal to cost, 1 plus the markup. So in this case, if my costs were 4 and my markup was 50% or 0.5, my price would be 6. Your book defines profit margin as price minus cost. A lot of times profit margin will be defined exactly as your markup, right? It's just what percentage above cost you are, and your book defines that as markup and defines profit margin as the following: price minus cost. So getting back to our previous example, suppose my costs are $23,000. I want a 40% markup, right? So that'll just be 23,000 times 1.4, and that gives me a price of 220, excuse me. Okay. So using this heuristic eases the complexity by setting pricing and ignoring market conditions. The advantage to cost plus pricing is that it's really simple. All I have to do is calculate my cost. Once I calculate my cost, I know what my price is going to be. I just multiply it by 1 plus 1. The problem is that the cost plus pricing doesn't take into consideration, right, what the demand for your product is. It might be very elastic and you might be able to increase your profits by increasing price, or it might be very elastic and you might be able to increase your profits by decreasing price. Okay. That's very related to a target return. In this case, your book has, I won't call it a complex example, but an example with more variables, right? So in this case, you'll set price according to your cost, your labor cost, your material cost, your marketing cost, your average fixed cost over 2, And in general, these are all gonna be per unit, so they're gonna be average costs too. And finally, I'm gonna take my gross operating assets. Basically, I take my assets and divide that by Q, and I multiply it by my target profit rate. So this is very similar to my markup, but I want, right, I'm calling it profit instead of markup. Basically, I take all of that and I add my profit rate to my assets. In other words, for all I have invested in my operating assets, not my total assets, my operating assets, and multiply it by whatever profit rate I want. Again, this doesn't take into account market considerations. Okay. It's often used by internet companies and government regulated companies. The problem with doing this, and most regulators have figured this out, is that when you do this, you eliminate the incentive to contain costs, right? If you're just going to give me or going to allow me to charge a price above my cost, then I have no incentive to try to lower my costs. When I was an undergrad back home in Mexico, pretty much all the utilities in the United States back then were regulated, and they pretty much still are, and Mexico still are. But back then, they basically were doing this, right? And the local company was taking advantage. Each one of their executives had their own Learjet. They had, at this time, remember, this was the late 70s, early 80s. They had $1 million conference table. Basically, it was just one piece of redwood from one of those big trees, those redwood trees in California. And it basically was the whole room, just one piece of wood at a table. But that cost $1 million. And basically, they had no incentive to restrict costs because they were basically a monopoly. They couldn't charge a monopoly price, but the price that they could charge increased as their cost increased. So they had every incentive not to contain costs, but to increase costs. Okay. So we know what our optimal markup is from before, right? 1 minus the absolute value of our elasticity demand minus 1. Okay. So our optimal markup is higher if demand is less elastic, or in other words, more inelastic. So here it is. We have our elasticity demand. All of these are elastic. They're greater than 1 in absolute terms, right? And then we have our optimal percentage markup above marginal cost over here. So if I'm just barely elastic, close to inelastic, right? My markup's really high. In this case, 1.2. My markup is 500. If it's more elastic, right, it starts to decrease. If it's really elastic, say 51, my markup's 2. But in general, a markup of 2, right, is still pretty darn high. It's 200% markup. But that means that in general, you can think that most demands for most corporate is really elastic, above 50
I think it's just 2%, right?
Oh, you're right, it's 2%. I'm sorry.
That's
My
very
bad.
small.
Okay. I apologize. You're right. Glad you guys come. Okay. But still, it's, even 2% is not a great markup. I was wondering when I saw the table, and I've seen this table like 3 times throughout the years. Okay. And I've never caught that before. My head was working badly, so thank you. Anyway, the more elastic, the smaller the markup. That was an important part of the table. Okay. Questions? for some reason, the book has this in this chapter. And this is a multi-product firm. Basically, this firm produces two products, right? And in general, we think that, or we analyze this when the production of one thing, right, leads naturally to the production of something else. The example I would think of are cattle, right? You produce beef and you produce leather at the same time. So your total revenue is going to be a total revenue from the first product plus the total revenue from the second product. Therefore, your marginal revenue is going to be the change in total product with respect to each of the two products. The first one, X, so marginal revenue of X is total revenue with respect to Q of X. And I break this down, this means that my total revenue of X with respect to X plus my total revenue of Y with respect to X, right? So my marginal revenue in this case has got two parts because I'm producing two things at once. And the same thing for Y, my marginal revenue for Y is equal to my total revenue for X with respect to Y plus my total revenue for Y with respect to Y. So if the two groups are substitutes, we'll call them the cross total revenues are going to be negative. In other words, the change in total revenue of X with respect to a change in Y is negative if they're substitutes, and the change in the total revenue of Y with respect to X would be negative again if they're substitutes. If they're complements, right? In other words, the demand for one increases the demand for the other, then those derivatives, right, are going to be positive. Okay. So my total marginal revenue curve, right, when I measure it graphically, is I add up marginal revenue of X plus the marginal revenue of Y at each given level, right? So the vertical summation of the two marginal revenue curves will give me my total marginal revenue. And the marginal revenue of both products is positive at the optimal level of output, assuming, right, this is the case. So here, right, I set my total marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, and that's going to give me Q, right? The price I charge for each, right, is going to depend on the demand curve for each product. So I produce Q, right, where my marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then for a product, in this case, we call it B, I charge P of B from the demand curve. And for product A, I charge P of A. Now, in this joint production, this works out great. First of all, it's in the marginal revenue portion of product A, the first one, or call it the first one to say, right? And it's not quite yet where this equals zero. So basically, it's the sum of the two marginal revenues, right? And from this point on, it's just the marginal revenue of A. But we're on this side. What if it's on this side of that point? In other words, one of the marginal revenues is zero at that quantity. Okay, so the marginal revenue of one product is negative, right? If the marginal product is negative at the optimal level. If the product's marginal revenue is negative, then the firm will dispose of the quantity sufficient to bring marginal revenue equal to zero, and thereby maximizing revenue, maximizing revenue on that product. So in this case, right, here's our summation of the marginal revenues, and then one of the marginal revenues equals 0, and then it's just the marginal revenue of A. Right? So I set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, right, and produce Q1. For product B, what I do is I set marginal revenue equal to 0, and I produce Q0 and charge PB according to the demand curve. What that means is I have to get rid of Q1 to Q0 that I don't sell on the market. I have to dispose of that quantity. And that's when I don't like my example, because I don't like the idea of disposing of, leather hide or meat. But it could be something else that that you produce 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 in a fixed ratio. Questions? Okay. So for these joint products, I'm going to define two curves. One is the ISO revenue line, right? It's a straight line showing the combination of output that produces the same total revenue. And then an isocost curve, and I hate that terminology because we already have an isocost curve, but it's not the same thing, right? This is when we have total costs, right, for two products that we produce at the same time. So it's a curve showing the amount of goods produced at the same total cost. Remember our isocost curve before, when we were talking about production, right, and two inputs, right, was a straight line. Here it's a curve, and instead of talking about two inputs, it's talking about two outputs. There are two outputs in our example. So in this case, right, I have my ISO revenue curve, and I have my ISO revenue line on my ISO cost curve, right? The curved one is my ISO cost. So at this first one, right, my total cost for every point on this line is 13. And for my ISO revenue line, my revenue is 17 on any point along that line. Where they meet is where profits maximized. In the first one, right, profits equal to 4. I move up here, and in this ISO cost curve, my total cost is 20. And in this ISO cost line, my total revenue is 25. Where they meet, my profit's 5. I go up one more, where on this ISO revenue curve, right, my total revenue is 37. And on this ISO cost curve, my total cost is 25. So in this case, my profit's 7. And finally, I have this yellow ISO cost curve and this dark purple ISO revenue line, okay? And where they meet, my profit's 6. So my profit is higher at this point right here, right? Where I'm producing 47 units of B and 42 units of A per day. And there my profit is 7. Questions? Okay. So we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk, instead of monopoly and multiple products, we're going to talk about something known as a monopsony. Instead of having a unique product to sell and being the only supplier of that product like monopoly, in this case, I'm the only user of an input. The most common example of this is maybe a hospital in a small town where it's the only hospital for miles, right? And therefore, it's the only employer of nurses, right? So basically, if you're a nurse and you want to work, you have to work at that hospital. So in contrast to the monopoly, right, the market consists of a single seller. This is the monopoly. In this case, Buyers in the competitive market face a horizontal supply curve. They're price takers. Right? There's only one buyer in the monopsony, and the buyer faces an upward sloping supply curve, which means that marginal cost is above the supply curve. Right? So under monopsony, the buyer will purchase a quantity where marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue product, or in other words, where my marginal expenditures are equal to my marginal revenue product, and I'll end up paying a price below marginal cost. Right? So we have an example. My labor supply is price is equal to C plus E times Q. My total cost, right, is in this case P times Q. So that's C plus E times Q times Q. I take the derivative and I'm getting marginal cost. So the change in cost over Q is going to be C plus 2EQ, which is my marginal cost. So the wage P and the quantity hired are both less than the competitive equilibrium. And hopefully the graph makes that a little more clear. So I have my labor supply curve, this blue line, right? I have my demand curve, which is the marginal benefit, or we can think of that demand curve as the marginal revenue product, right? Because I'm going to keep hiring. If I was in a competitive industry, I'm going to hire as long as the money that input makes for me, in this case, the money that worker makes for me, right, is at least as much as I'm paying. And I'm going to keep hiring workers until I get to that point where they're equal. But under a monopsony, instead of having labor supply equal to my marginal revenue product, right here, right, in this case, my marginal expenditure, right, is going to equal my marginal revenue product, X, and that's going to determine the quantity I hire. So in this case, I hire less of this input, in this case workers, and pay them a price below the market, what would be the market clearing wage, where supply equals demand at P2. So this hospital will hire less nurses and pay them a lower price. And that's the theory behind monopsony. Questions? Okay, switching from monopsony, we're going to talk about monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition has the characteristics of perfect competition. The only difference is product heterogeneity. Under perfect competition, we assume that everybody's selling the exact same thing. Under monopolistic competition, I can differentiate my product. That means that each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. Under perfect competition, I'm a price taker. I can't differentiate my products from anybody else's, so I have to basically accept the market price. Under monopolistic competition, there's a lot of sellers, right? A lot of buyers. There's free entry and exit. Perfect dissemination of information. Everybody knows everything about everybody else. But the difference is I can get people to believe that my product is different than other people's product. Hopefully, I can convince them that my product's better than everybody else, right? And as long as I have that product differentiation, I'll face a downward sloping demand curve. Okay. So products are perceived as identical, are not perceived as identical by consumers. So that means managers have some pricing discretion, but the products are similar, and therefore the price differences aren't going to be all that big. Competition takes place within a product group. The example I gave a while ago were soft drinks, right? There are people that prefer Pepsi to Coke or Coke to Pepsi, but I think the majority of people are pretty much indifferent between the two. So that product group is a group of firms that produce a similar product. In my example, soft drinks. Conditions that must be met in addition to product differentiation. There must be many firms in that product group. In general, for soft drinks, not really monopolistic competition because there are two big ones, but there's a bunch of little small ones. And wherever you go, right, you'll find the little small ones. They're always right next to the Coke aisle, and depending on where you go, they'll be different in different places. When I was growing up, there was a soft drink called Shasta. And what usually ends up happening is Coke or Pepsi end up buying the smaller ones, and then another smaller one pops up. The number of firms in a product group must be large enough that each firm expects its actions to go unheeded by its rivals and unimpeded by possible retaliation moves on their part. So soft drinks don't really fly in there, but I think we could probably think of something or some group that is close to monopolistic competition. Entry into the product group must be relatively easy. There must be no collusion, such as price fixing or market sharing among the managers in the product group. And that's going to be hard if you fit the other characteristics, i.e., a large number of sellers. In that case, it's going to be hard to coordinate the collusion and the increased price. So, starting with the graph, it looks just like a monopolist graph, right? We have a downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenues below the demand curve. And I set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost right here. And here I have average total cost. So what that means is here, at least in the short run, this monopolistic competitor is making a profit. But just like perfect competition, when people see this person making a profit, they want to enter the product group. And since there's free entry, right, you'll have more people entering the group and and competing with this. When that happens, the demand curve for this firm will start to shift in. And it'll keep shifting in until, right, there's no more incentive for other firms to enter. In other words, when economic profits are zero. So here, the marginal revenue equals marginal cost at that price. At that price, price is equal to average total cost. What that means is this monopolistically competitive firm isn't making an economic profit. Right? Basically, its profits are zero, and then no more firms enter. Okay. Questions? You want me to do this on the board, the graph, or is it pretty clear? Okay. Doing this one. Let's see if this one's doing better. Okay. So, as I said, it looks a lot like a monopolist to start with, right? And their profits, to start with, are going to be this triangle here. But as competition starts to increase, when people see that there's an economic profit to be made, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve starts to shift in, right? And I know I had it set up last time a second ago, I can't find it. So it starts to shift in. I have a new demand curve and a new marginal revenue curve. And profit starts to get smaller. Until finally, let me see if I can draw this. The demand curve will shift such where economic profits are zero, where price equals average total cost. In the graph up here, it just happens to be just barely tangents. The truth is, there's no reason for it to be tangent as long as it's touching that total cost curve at that point. Questions? Okay. Oh. Okay. So, we talked about monopoly and monopolistic competition and some aspects of monopoly. Now, I want to talk a little about advertising. Oops. Dang it. Okay. How much should an advertiser spend on advertising? Or how much should a firm spend on advertising? I'm going to assume that the benefits from advertising exhibit some kind of diminishing return. Right? In other words, the first $1,000 that I spend on advertising gives me a big increase in demand. But then the second 1,000 that I spend gives me a much smaller increase, etc. And I'm going to assume that the quantity demanded depends only on price and advertising revenues. In other words, that's the only thing that affects the demand curve. Right? And someday, this thing will suck back up. I hope. Okay. So, I guess I'm gonna have to write it. Here I have advertising expenditures. And 0.8 million, 0.9 million, 1 million. Actually, it's coming up. Okay. Hopefully it'll become brighter in a second. So I have 0.8 million, and that gives me, and at that point I sell 15 million units. If I spent 0.9 million or $900,000, I get 17 million units sold. If I spend $1 million in advertising, I get 18.5 million. And if I spend 1,100,000, I get 19.5. And finally, if I spend 1,200,000, I get 20 million sold. Now, I noticed that every 100,000 that I spent gives me less of a product bump in terms of the product sold than the 100,000 before it did. Again, as I said, so diminishing returns to advertising, right? Again, I'm going to define net profit as I did a while ago, price minus marginal cost, omitting advertising expenditures. So my advertising expenditures are optimal if an increase in the net profit from additional dollars spent on advertising is equal to $1. So basically, I spend $1 on advertising. If I'm getting more than $1 return on my profits, I keep advertising. And I keep doing so until it's 1 for 1. Every dollar I spent, or the last dollar I spent on advertising, is equal to or results in a $1 increase in profit. Okay. So, was it that way before? Up here?
No. No.
Oh. Okay, well, I'm missing the bottom, but that's okay. Okay, so if the change in Q is defined as the number of extra units sold as a result of an additional dollars of expenditures, then advertising expenditures are optimal when, and this is basically what we talked about in the last slide, the change in Q times P minus marginal cost is equal to 1, right? That implies that the marginal revenue from an extra dollar of advertising is equal to the absolute value of elasticity of demand. Right? And then we get that from our optimal markup formula. Right? So when advertising expenditures are optimal, right, managers therefore increase advertising expenditures until that condition is met. That the extra dollar from advertising expenditures equals the absolute value of elasticity of demand. Right? In our next graph, we're going to have two curves, right? Curve A is a relationship between advertising expenditures and the absolute value of price elasticity of demand. High expenditures cause demand to be less elastic, so we're going to have a downward sloping curve. And another curve, the relationship between my marginal revenue from an extra dollar of advertising and my total advertising expenditures. So profits and advertising expenditures. So here, right, this dark purple line is the absolute value of price elasticity of demand, right? On the horizontal axis, I have the absolute value of price elasticity or marginal revenue. And on the horizontal axis, I have advertising expenditures. So as I increase my advertising expenditures, right, my my elasticity of demand decreases, right? It's more inelastic, right? And here, my marginal revenue from extra dollar of advertising increases as I have more advertising. Or, I'm sorry, decreases as I have more advertising. I get less bang for my buck. And where they meet here at point R is my optimal level of advertising expenditure. Right? Where those two curves meet. Now going back one, we can look at what B prime is, the other curve. Right? The intersection of curve A and curve B defines the optimal level of advertising. Curve B prime represents a shift in curve B due to increasing advertising effectiveness, right? The result in an increase in advertising expenditures. So this is our first equilibrium, right? And if for some reason advertising gets better, you guys, we have a genius in this class who majors in marketing or who focuses on marketing and makes advertising more effective. We get a new curve and a new equilibrium. We spend more on advertising. Questions? Okay. So that was advertising. Now I'm going to talk about two aspects of advertising. Well, And then we'll be done for today. Promotions. We're basically trying to get people to buy your product in the short term. It appeals to price sensitivity. Of course, it's a price-oriented message. An attempt to erode brand loyalty. In other words, buy my stuff is cheaper, and all their stuff is hype or name. So it's an attempt to increase price elasticity and limit the premiums consumers are willing to pay for brand name products. Those are promotions. And compare that with advertising. It does the opposite. It attempts to build brand loyalty. I buy my stuff even though it costs more because it's better, right? Or it'll make you advance socially or make your neighbors jealous, whatever it might be. Loyalty is measured as the frequency of repeat purchases. It's a product quality-oriented message. As I said, buy my stuff, it's better. The evidence is promotions do increase price elasticities. When I come in and I lower my price, people buy my stuff more. Promotions have less effect on brand loyalists. If you really like Coke, if you're one of those people who really like Coke and Pepsi comes along and lowers their price, you're probably not going to switch to Pepsi. The effectiveness of promotions decay over time. But price elasticity of non-loyalists was found to be about 4 times that of loyalists. If I don't care about Coke, I'll buy Pepsi or whatever else it might be. And finally, the effects of advertising on brand loyalty erode over time as price becomes more important to consumers. I might be that person who really likes Coke, but over time, it might be that another soft drink, if the price is low enough, will convince me to switch over. Questions? Questions on anything? Okay. All right. Monopolist is always a short lecture. Next week, we're going to talk about, or the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about bundling. And time. And we're going to talk about price discrimination, ways that when you have pricing power, not necessarily you need to be a monopolist, but when you have pricing power, ways that a firm can increase their profits taking advantage of that pricing power that they have. All right, have a good weekend. I'll see you next week.